right. Do you have any other announcements, Tom, before I get started?
Yes, one announcement. I emailed everybody about an hour ago with the dates for all of the lab trips coming up. It's fresh off the press. I'll have the details in Blackboard in the discussion area in the next few days. But you've got all the dates now, so you can ask the employers off and whatever you got to do. But there we go. And I think that's it.
Okay. Well, if you think of anything at the end, just jump in. Okay, so today we're going to quickly go through Chapter 6 because it is going to be on the test. We'll only have like a few questions from Chapter 6 on the test. So I'm going to go through that PowerPoint, and then after that, I finish that, I'm going to kind of go through some review questions and talk a little bit more about the test format and everything so you kind of know how to prepare for that. Any questions on anything before I get started? Everybody's done the career assignment. If you haven't, that's due Wednesday. It's Wednesday night at like 11:59 p.m. So if you haven't done that yet, make sure that you do that. Okay. Oh, and so Tom, quick update. So I am talking to a guy at Zoom for technical support, and apparently I have the latest version that should have the update for the PowerPoint crashing thing. But lucky me, mine is still crashing, so they're trying to like figure out how to fix it. So we're still gonna have to look at it like this.
No, okay.
But apparently they're working on it because they can't figure out why I have the newest version, but it's apparently not resolved, and that was the thing they resolved with this version. So anyway.
Okay.
Just a little update. So I don't know if anybody else that you work with uses Zoom. If they're having that problem, then they need to contact technical support so they can get on it.
Okay. I haven't heard of anybody complaining. But...
It must just be me. I don't understand. Really bad luck. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Good. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about companion animals, which is always a fun lecture to discuss because, you know, not everyone has livestock, but usually a lot of people have like a cat or a dog or some kind of cool pet. So today we're going to talk about cats and dogs, a little bit about their numbers, like how many are in the U.S., how they're classified, how their domestication came about, which we've kind of touched on before, some definitions and terminology, uses, and then we're going to touch on reproduction and nutrition, kind of like we did for horses in the last lecture. And then we'll briefly talk about ferrets, rodents, pet birds, monkeys, and reptiles and amphibians. So companion animals are defined by the ASPCA as a domesticated or domestic bred animal whose physical, emotional, behavioral, and social needs can be readily met as companions in the home, or they can live and get that from a close daily relationship with humans. So we're going to start with cats. And so there are approximately 85 million cats in the U.S., and typically about 30% of households have at least one cat. And about 84% of those cats are spayed or neutered. So you can see that there's quite a bit that aren't. And then you also have like your barn cats and things like that. I actually see a lot of cats at like feed mills that I go to and things like that. So there are a lot of feral cats as well. Cats are good companions and they develop close relationships with people. And for the most part, they're affectionate and they like being stroked. With my cat, she'd probably beg to differ on that one. She has kind of a threshold of about 5 seconds, and then she's kind of over it. So for the most part, I've heard that cats can be pretty affectionate, but she's an interesting one. So just some terminology, like we kind of went over with horses, like, you know, how you call like a baby horse if it's a female and all of that. So we're going to kind of go through that vocabulary for cats. You may know some of these already. Some of these may be kind of new to you. So an adult female cat is called a queen, and an intact adult male is called a tom. A gib is a castrated male, which I had actually never really heard that term used that much until I started preparing these lectures. So you're surprised by that, so was I. Dam is a term for the mother of a litter, and you'll see the words dam and sire come up more too when we start talking about livestock, so it's not just specific to cats. The sire is a father of a litter, and then kittens obviously are young cats. Everyone's probably heard that. The process of giving birth is actually called kittening in cats. So it kind of makes sense because they're kittens, but it's just kind of a weird word, I think. And then the adjective that refers to cats is feline, of course. So the domestic cat is referred to as Felis catus. So it's pretty easy to remember. You think about like feline and then cat. And so other members of this family include the lion, tiger, leopard, jaguar, bobcat, cougar, and the lynx. So the ancestor of today's domesticated cat is thought to be the Near East African cat. And as we kind of mentioned in a lecture before, they came from the Fertile Crescent. So that was kind of the area where a lot of plants and animals were domesticated. And so that's a good thing to remember. That will show up in the test review for sure. So archaeologists actually unearthed a burial of a woman and a cat together from 9,500 years ago. So that's kind of a good indication that by that point cats were domesticated. Otherwise, a cat probably wouldn't just be laying with her. So cats were domesticated to reduce problems of mice and rats infesting stored grain. So like I said, once people started establishing those permanent settlements and they started storing food because they weren't like hunting and gathering all the time on the road, then you start attracting rodents and things like that. So cats could help with that problem. And they still help with that problem. Like I said, I see them at feed mills, even though it's pretty much against the health code now, they still show up there like all the time. So if anyone ever needs some cats, I can get you a cat at any point in time because they are always trying to get me to take them off their hands. So feral cats are domesticated cats that successfully reverted to the wild. We've talked about that term before, so be familiar with what feral means. So the problem with feral cats is that their populations can actually threaten other wildlife populations, including wild birds, obviously because they prey on birds. So if you have a large population of wild cats, it's going to potentially hurt your bird population. And so feral cats can actually interbreed with the European wildcat. So I know how we kind of talked about like mules and how they're typically sterile and things like that because they're a cross. So it's just kind of another interesting thing about cats is that they can actually interbreed with cats in the wild. So therapy cats are also another use of cats as kind of companion animals. So the presence of docile cats, this is very important, that like to be stroked, that actually like to be touched and held, because again, my cat does not. They can actually improve the quality of living for nursing home residents or hospital residents. And of course, that depends on if that place would actually let you bring a cat in. But a lot of times you think of therapy dogs, but they're actually therapy cats. So it's kind of neat. I feel like you'd have to have the definite right cat for that, though, because I feel like all cats have different personalities. So now we're just going to talk a little bit about cat reproduction and genetics. So cats are seasonally polyestrous. So does that term sound kind of familiar, ringing some bells from last week's lecture on horses? So seasonally means that they kind of come into heat a specific time of the, or sorry, they don't come into heat a specific time of the year, but they will kind of cycle in a certain time of the year. And polyestrous means that they're going to have many estrus cycles. So the other cool thing about cats that I really want you to know, because I remember them stressing this in my intro class for some reason, is that they are what we call induced or reflex ovulators. And so this means that actually cats will only ovulate after mating. So with other animals, it's like they're kind of ovulating whenever they're cycling. And then you try to kind of line up breeding with when they're ovulating. But with cats, they will only do it after mating. And so the idea is that if they just mated and then she ovulates, there's a better chance that she's actually going to conceive. So be familiar with the term induced or reflex ovulators. They mean the same thing. So you can say induced ovulators or reflex ovulators, and I would give you credit for both. So just kind of a cool thing about cats. So their gestation length is about 60 days, so it's pretty short, which is, again, why cats at the feed mill are a problem, because, like, every time you turn around, they've had another litter of kittens, and if your cats are not spayed or neutered, it can get out of hand really fast. So kittens are born in an immature state, and the scientific term for that is just called altricial. And so basically that just means that they have the limited capacity to see and move around. So have you ever seen a litter of kittens? You know, their eyes are closed, they can't really like get around very well. So their mom needs to be there to take care of them for a little while. So kind of be familiar with what that term means. So cats have 38 chromosomes, which equals 19 pairs, and cats can be either short-haired or long-haired. So the short-hair genotype is actually dominant, which kind of makes sense because if you think about most cats that you've seen in your life, you've probably seen way more short-haired cats than you have long-haired cats. And so that long-hair genotype is actually recessive. So you're not going to see as many of those. It's not going to show up as often. And so a single gene, a single spot on a gene controls hair length, which is kind of interesting because it's not like a combination of a bunch of different genes. It's literally just one point on a gene that controls hair length. And the difference is that actually there are several genes that control coat color. So just kind of interesting fact there. So there are a lot of different genetic abnormalities that you can have with any species really, but we're going to talk about some with cats. So I don't know if anyone's ever heard of a Manx cat, but they actually lack a tail. So they're kind of cute, actually. I think a lot of these abnormalities are actually kind of cute. If you like Google them, they're pretty adorable. So those lack a tail. So they are what we call heterogeneous for the trait. So that means that they just have one copy of the mutated gene. Because for everyone, they're going to have like two, if they're homozygous, they're going to have two copies. If they're heterozygous, they're going to have one copy. So if they have a homozygous, which is two copies, that is actually lethal. So you won't actually see any cats that are homozygous for that trait. Not that you would see it because it's in their DNA. But so just heterozygous means one copy because hetero means different. So they've got one copy of the mutated gene and then one copy of the normal gene. And then homozygous means you have two copies that are the same. So the Scottish fold is another mutation, and that is actually just a unique ear fold, and this is one I really encourage you to Google because they are adorable. So basically, like their ears just kind of like fold down, and I think they're really cute. And so actually in my intro class, I was told that kind of started, actually a couple of these kind of started with like someone found a barn cat way back when that had this kind of cute mutation, or somebody thought it was cute. And then they actually bred that cat, and then eventually created kind of a breed from it. So you can actually get a Scottish fold cat if you want to now. Munchkin cats are another mutation, and again, some people think it's kind of cute. They are kind of cute, I think. So it's basically a form of dwarfism. So they have really short legs. So you could think of them as like a corgi dog, kind of, but like a little cat. Polydactyly, which is not specific to cats, but it's something that can happen, is basically just extra digits. So they may have like 6, 7, or even more toes. And it's a relatively common trait in the US. So poly just means like multiple, again with polyestrous, many, that's what poly means. And then dactyly is kind of like digits. And so if you've ever seen a cat that had like extra claws kind of hanging out, that's what that is. So a little bit about cat nutrition. Cats are carnivores, which means that they can live on a meat-only diet. So remember we talked about horses and how are horses classified? Does anybody remember? Are they carnivores or what are they? Any idea? They eat plants, right? So does anyone remember what the term is?
Herbivores.
Herbivores, yes, exactly. Good job. So horses eat plants and cats eat meat-only diet. And so, of course, you're thinking that, but then you're like, okay, well, I feed my cat food, and that's not a steak, right? So other things aren't going to hurt them, like things that are in their cat food, like other fillers, but they can survive on a meat-only diet. So they would have a diet with high amounts of carbohydrates, fats, and protein. And so the reason that cats are carnivores, or one really important aspect of that is that cats require what is called taurine, which is an essential amino acid. So we're not going to get too far into this right now because we'll save that for the nutrition lecture. But basically, amino acids are what make up protein. And you have a bunch of different amino acids. And so taurine is one that is essential, meaning that they have to have it, and their body actually cannot make it. So cats have to get taurine from meat. And so this is an important reason why you can't feed dog food to cats. A lot of people, and like my cat loves to get into my dog food, and so a lot of people like have that problem where, I don't know, cats really want to eat the dog food, but you always want to make sure that if you have a cat that they're actually getting food that is specifically for cats, because typically dog food does not have taurine in it, at least not to the levels that a cat would need it. So make sure that if you have a cat, you're actually feeding it cat food. Although I do know a person that had a cat that ate only dog food for like 10 years and it's fine. But if you get a cat that like really is maybe more sensitive to it, or you're feeding a dog food that doesn't have any sort of meat product, you could run into issues. So, and as you can see, taurine is bolded there, so that's probably going to show up on your test. I'm probably going to ask you what's the essential amino acid that cats need, because that's really important, and it's something that kind of separates them from the rest of the animals that we're going to talk about.
Do feral cats get it?
How do feral cats get it? Is that what you said? So if you think about it, like they're preying on like probably mice and smaller things like that. So that would, even though we don't think of mice as like meat, they would still have like that protein in there.
So if your house cat was just eating mice, you'd be fine?
Yeah, you'd be fine. If you have like an outdoor cat that's just catching stuff outside, fine.
It's just only, so it's only the food we're giving them is, but I don't understand. Hey, out in the wild, I'm sorry, I'm just confused about it.
Oh, you're good. So if they're out in the wild, then they're catching things that would have meat, right? Like an animal, like a mouse, is going to be a source of meat for them. But if you have a cat that's like strictly indoor and you're only giving it dog food, then the dog food isn't going to provide them with the taurine. So you would just need to make sure you're giving them a food for cats. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? But yeah, if your cat's like indoor, outdoor, and it's eating stuff outside, then they're going to catch what they need to fulfill their requirements. So like, you don't really have to worry about that.
So really the only thing that, because I guess what I'm getting at is just keeping it, you really don't want to keep your cat inside.
You can keep it inside. Just if you keep it inside, just make sure that you're giving it cat food. And you're not just feeding it like, a bag of dog food. Make sure that you're actually giving it cat food. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like my cat's completely 100% indoor, and she tries to go after the dog food, but I keep it away from her and I give her a specific food for cats. So yeah, you can totally keep them indoor and outdoor. Just make sure they're not just living off dog food is basically the only thing. So obesity can be a problem in cats. It can also be a problem in dogs, which we'll talk about. And so that's because the diets usually contain more nutrients than are actually required for the animal. And this can lead to obesity. And so it's something that you kind of need to watch, especially when cats get older and they're not as active. So about 1/3 of all domestic cats in the U.S. are overweight or obese. And like I said, this can be with a lot of companion animals. People like to give them a lot of treats, and they don't always take into account that if they're giving them treats, then maybe you need to cut their food back a little bit, because cats aren't that big, so they don't need all that much food if you've already given them a couple of treats. So just kind of something to watch. And then whenever you get food for your cat, on the back of the bag, it'll have like feeding instructions for their weight. So a lot of people I know just kind of guess, and they just kind of throw a scoop out there. And for some cats, it's not a problem. They'll kind of eat till they're full. For other cats, they will eat and eat and eat everything that's in front of them. And that can lead to obesity, as it can with people. So this can be a problem because it can cause long-term health consequences, which include diabetes. So diabetes is actually a pretty big thing in cats. I know several people that have actually made their cats diabetic because they didn't feed them properly. It's not just from not feeding them properly, but it doesn't help. They can develop lower urinary tract disease, hepatic lipidosis, which would be a problem with the liver, and lameness due to arthritis in cats. Because when animals become like obese or fat, we kind of don't think about how much that's actually putting pressure on their joints. So, if a cat is 5 pounds overweight, you can kind of almost think of that, and this is just a rough number, as a human being like 30 to 40 pounds overweight, so it's kind of a drastic thing. So you want to make sure that you're kind of keeping them in the proper weight range, and feeding them properly so that they live longer and they don't have like joint damage or any other problems. And I kind of harp on this because, again, I'm an animal nutritionist, so I get a little intense about it. But my dog is probably a couple pounds overweight, so who am I to judge? So these are just some pictures of the cat breeds. So the Cat Fanciers Association, which is what it's called, recognizes and registers 41 pedigreed breeds. So like I said, a lot of these were mutations that just started with a kitten somebody found, and then they decided that it looked cool. And so they started breeding them. And I saved you to Google. You can see these pictures and how cute they are. So this is the Scottish Fold, this gray one on the left. And then in the middle, you have the American Curl. So their ears kind of do the opposite. They like curl backwards. And then the Manx cat is the cat that I mentioned with no tail. So I don't know whether you find them cute, but I think they're adorable. So shifting gears to dogs, there are 73 million dogs in the U.S. Don't need that also million. So 39% of households have at least one dog. So that's just a little higher than the percentage of households that have cats, but pretty close. And then more than 70% of dogs that are owned are spayed or neutered. So it's a pretty good percentage. But it could probably stand to go up so that we don't have too many dogs. So that leaves 30% of dogs that can and actually do breed. And so dogs can then be abandoned for a lot of reasons. And it's estimated that up to 2 million dogs are killed each year in the U.S. So I always highly recommend, unless you're specifically breeding like, a breed or something to sell puppies, if it's just a pet or something like that, I always recommend that you get them spayed or neutered, because there are so many dogs that don't have homes. And so if we can cut down on that, then that would be great, because every time I go to a shelter, I try to come home with an animal. I'm going to be an animal hoarder. So dogs make excellent companion animals, as I'm sure most of you know. I'm sure some of you probably have a dog. They're extremely loyal and affectionate, and so they do make excellent companions. So talking a little bit about their nomenclature like we did for cats, an adult female dog is called a bitch, which we don't think of as the nicest word, but that's the scientific name. The adult male dog is just called a dog. And then they're the words dam and sire again. So dam just means mother of a litter, and sire means father. So as long as you know dam means mother and sire means father, that's pretty much what I want you to get out of that. Pups or puppies are young dogs that are less than a year old. And whelping is the process of giving birth. So you would think based on the cat nomenclature that it would be like puppying or something, but it's called whelping. And canine is the adjective that refers to dogs. So dogs are traditionally classified scientifically as Canis familiaris. So they could be considered kind of a subspecies of the gray wolves, because they kind of were domesticated from wolves. And so the Canis genus includes wolves, jackals, and coyotes. And so interbreeding of all of the members of that group can actually produce fertile hybrids. So again, going back to the mule, which is from a donkey and a horse, that is not a fertile hybrid. It's a hybrid animal, because remember we talked about that hybrid vigor term, but they're usually not fertile. But with dogs, if they interbreed with anybody in that group, they can actually produce fertile hybrids. So I've actually met a wolf hybrid before, which was pretty cool. It was like, it basically looked like a wolf, but it was like a wolf and a dog had bred, and it was pretty neat. So like I said, dogs were domesticated from gray wolves at least 15,000 years ago by hunter-gatherers in East Asia. And so it's possible that there were multiple domestication events. So that just kind of means that it wasn't like a, one and done, like, okay, they're domesticated now. It was possible that there were multiple and maybe in different areas. So East Asia is kind of the main one that we know about, but it's possible that they were also being domesticated elsewhere. So they accompanied humans as the humans crossed the Bering Strait into North America 14,000 years ago. So we definitely know that they've been domesticated for a long time. So how exactly did domestication of dogs occur? So basically, wolf packs would live very close by to groups of hunter-gatherers to scavenge for waste. So that kind of makes sense because these people were out hunting. They're going to be, killing these animals and then using what they want. And then you're going to probably have carcasses left over that are lying around that are going to draw in the wolves. So that's going to kind of keep the wolves around people at that point in time. So what they kind of think happened was that maybe children actually tamed some orphaned wolf pups, that maybe like some pups got left behind at some point, and children kind of socialized with them and played with them. And so then you kind of have the selection for the wolf pups that would be less aggressive or kind of tame, and then eventually that all just kind of led up to the dogs that we have today. So there are different uses of dogs. Dogs can be used to herd cattle and sheep. They can be used as hunting dogs. They can be used as guards. My dog is like extremely intense about security around here. That German Shepherd side of him is just makes him crazy. And they can also be used for racing, so like sled dogs, and then fighting, which is of course illegal in the U.S. and they shouldn't be used for that. But that's on me. They can also be used as like drug dogs or bomb dogs because dogs' sense of smell is extremely sensitive. It's way more sensitive than ours is. They can be used as police dogs, military dogs, and then of course service or assistant animals for like blindness or deafness, or as therapy dogs. And another thing that I think is cool about service dogs is that they're now like, it's not even just if you're blind or deaf. It's like there are dogs where if someone has diabetes, they can sense that their blood sugar is low, or someone that has epilepsy, a dog can actually sense and smell the changes in their body and can alert that person that they're going to have a seizure so that they can get to a safe place. Actually, the gym that I go to, there's a guy who has that, and so his dog goes to the gym with him to let him know if he's going to have a seizure so that he can get off the equipment. So it's pretty remarkable when you think about service dogs. Like, it's just kind of amazing what all they can do. So therapy dogs are actually different from service dogs. So they're not specifically trained for like a certain task, whereas service dogs are going to be trained for, to sniff out drugs or whatever they're going to be doing. So they're basically just docile, which means kind of calm and tame, friendly, and interact well with people. So just dogs that are extremely friendly, love everybody. You kind of think of like a golden retriever or something like that. Commonly used in nursing homes to improve quality of life. Because old people that are in nursing homes don't really get a lot of interaction. They probably don't see a lot of animals. So it's a really, really cool thing to see therapy dogs used for that. So dogs have 78 chromosomes, 39 pairs, so quite a bit more than cats. And so because they have so many different chromosomes, there's a large variation in size, coat, and behavior. And so if you kind of think about that compared to cats, you've got some really large cats. You've got a lot of variation with cats, but then you think of like a Chihuahua versus like a Great Dane. So like dogs are kind of a lot more varied in their size and their coat colors and even their behavior. So another kind of cool thing is that about 94% of the dog's genes are actually in the same exact order as in the human and mouse genomes. So basically we kind of have like 94% of our genes in common with dogs and mice, which is kind of interesting. So breed parentage can be identified in dogs by DNA analysis. So I don't know if anybody's heard of the little like kits that they'll mail you now where you can like send some of your dog's hair or something and then they can tell you exactly what breed your dog is. I mean, if you don't know already, obviously. Like if you got a chocolate lab, you know it's a lab. But like if you have a mixed dog that you got, so that's kind of cool. So it's estimated that there are between 350 and 400 different breeds of dogs. So most modern breeds have been around for less than 400 years. So they haven't really come about all that long ago. When we think about as long as dogs have been domesticated, we've really kind of only started selecting these for breeds about 400 years ago. So when it comes to registering a dog, they can only be registered if both parents are registered. And the American Kennel Club, or the AKC, recognizes 150 breeds. So as you can see, there are 350 to 400 different breeds, but only 150 of those are actually recognized by the AKC. It may be a few more now, but that's what the number was a few years ago. And so they actually recognize different breed groups. So the groups are sporting, working, terrier, toy, so like if you have a toy poodle or something like that, non-sporting, herding, and then miscellaneous. So we kind of think they could include the other breeds in miscellaneous, but apparently they don't. So as far as dog reproduction, dogs are what we call monoestrous. So mono means one. So basically they have one estrus cycle, and it's followed, if they're not pregnant, by a period of anestrus. So that means that they don't have another cycle, or reproductive quiescence for about 6 months. So basically they'll kind of have one estrus cycle, and then they are either pregnant or not. And if they're not, then they kind of have nothing going on for about 6 months. It's kind of a little bit different than like cats, which are induced ovulators. So their gestation length is 52 to 58 days, with about typically 6 puppies per litter. And I would say that number would really vary with breed. So 6 is kind of an average, but I know dogs that have had way more than 6, and I know some dogs that have had like 1 or 2. So it's really dependent on the breed and the age of the dog, and a lot of different factors. But so their gestation length is a little bit longer than cats. So another cool thing about dogs is that a dog has actually been cloned before. So the first dog was cloned in 2005 at the Seoul National University in Korea. And so this is actually a picture of the dog that was cloned, and its name was Snuppy, the Afghan hound. So you can see, so it's not just like it had a puppy. It is an exact genetic clone of that dog. So it's not really necessarily an offspring, because it's exactly a clone. So that's kind of cool. So dog nutrition is very interesting, and I will kind of explain this. So people always want to think that dogs are carnivores like cats, right? Because you think of wolves in the wild, like eating deer and things like that. So dogs are largely carnivorous, but they can live on food other than meat. So they are actually considered omnivores, which means that they eat meat and plants. So they're not like cats where they have to have the meat because of the taurine. They can actually thrive on things other than meat. Like they could just live on like vegetables or other things. So that's why dogs are classified as omnivores. And this is typically widely accepted now that they're omnivores, but like if you find an old book, you may still see somewhere that it says that they're carnivores. And so there's kind of like the never-ending debate whether they're carnivores or omnivores, but most people have gone with the fact that they're omnivores now. So dogs are monogastrics, which you might remember that word from the horse lecture, which means that they have one simple stomach. And so they require protein, energy as carbohydrate and fat, together with a balance of minerals and vitamins. So basically same requirements as every other animal species that we're going to talk about. So this is just a picture of the dog's digestive system, just to kind of show you. I'm not going to make you like label this drawing on a test or anything like that. This is kind of just to help you see it. So again, like in the horse, you have the esophagus, which is just the tube from the mouth to the stomach. Although it actually there looks like it's connected to the liver, but the liver is kind of like attached. It doesn't actually go directly to the liver. So the esophagus goes to the stomach, and then you have the liver, which is going to produce a lot of enzymes and things. And then you have the small intestine and then the large intestine. And so when we get to the nutrition lecture, we'll talk a little bit more about what each of those parts do. So, dog nutrition, again, we'll just kind of continue with this. Like I said with cats, attention should be paid to the amount of food that they're given. And so make sure that dogs don't have access to excess feed. So make sure that, like, if you have a bag out, that your dog can't get into it and just eat the whole bag while you're away. Because my dog did that one time when he was a puppy and he got very, very sick. He's never done it again because he learned, but some dogs will just continue to eat. And so another thing I always mention with dogs is that I feel like more so than cats, dogs get a lot of leftovers. We're really bad about like having pizza. Oh, we'll just give the dog the pizza crust. If you're doing a lot of that, then you need to make sure that you're cutting back how much food that you're actually giving them. So like if you're giving them 5 cups a day and you just gave them a bunch of pizza crust, give them 4 cups. Like just kind of have that mindset so that your dog doesn't become overweight. And especially with like certain breeds, like labs are especially prone to obesity and things like that. And so much like cats, it can cause arthritis. It can make a lot of problems for your animal as it gets older. And I've heard a lot of vets say like they don't like to operate on fat animals because they have to like get through all the fat to actually get to the problem. It takes a lot longer. So just lots of reasons that you should be really careful about how much exercise your animal is getting. And if they're not getting that much exercise because they're older, you can cut back the amount of food that they're getting because they don't require as much. So just always make sure that based on whatever food you're giving them, just look at the back of the bag and it'll tell you based on their weight. And you don't have to know their exact weight, just kind of guess how much you should be giving them. So another thing that I always like to talk about, and some of you have probably, heard that chocolate is bad for dogs. So not all people food is actually safe for dogs. So like things like chocolate's a big one, like I said, that people hear. And so some dogs I had a dog that got into chocolate. She was fine, but most dogs can have a bad reaction to it. And then there are lots of other foods that you may not think of that are really bad for dogs, like grapes, garlic, onions, chicken bones are really, really bad. I know a lot of people like to give dogs chicken bones, but they can actually splinter in the dog's throat, and it can be extremely bad. So if you have a dog, I would encourage you, especially if it's a smaller dog, I would encourage you to kind of like Google foods that are bad for your dog because some dogs can have really bad reactions to things. And I say smaller dog because like my dog is 95 pounds. So like if he eats a grape, he's going to be fine. But if you have a smaller dog that isn't, as big and they eat a grape or two and they're sensitive to it, it could hurt their liver and it could cause a lot of problems. So, and it's kind of with the people food thing, it's kind of like some dogs have reactions to some of these foods. So they kind of say that it's kind of an all general, don't feed your dog this, because if they do have a reaction to it, it could be bad. So I would encourage you, if you have a dog, just kind of pay attention to that. So there are milk replacer formulas available for neonatal puppies. So like if you have a puppy that is maybe a runt or something, isn't getting a lot of milk, or you're taking that puppy or you found a puppy somewhere, you can get a milk replacer formula. However, it's not going to be as rich in nutrients as their mother's milk. So kind of going along with the last slide and what we talked about in cats, obesity in dogs is a really big problem. So the incidence of obesity in the U.S. in dogs is between 20 and 40%. So that's actually pretty high. And so this is mainly caused by overfeeding. So again, like I said with cats, high calorie snacks, treats, and people food. So, people like to give their dog treats all day, right? Like you want to have them sit or you want to have them come to you, and a lot of people use treats for that. And then people food. And so you can easily see how all of that can add a lot of calories that you're not thinking about, and then you're giving them the same amount for dinner. So just try to be aware of it. And if they, like I said, if they had a bunch of leftovers, cut back on their dry feed that you're giving them or whatever food you're giving them. And then bear in mind their activity levels. Like I said, if you have an older dog that doesn't get around a lot, cut their feed back. Because the effects of obesity include reduced lifespan, so you can actually take years off of that dog's life. Cardiovascular disease, again, diabetes like in cats, and then arthritis on their joints, which can be really bad. And there actually are low-calorie dog foods available. So if you have a dog that is overweight, you can get them on a low-calorie formula for a little while until they kind of lose weight, or just cut back their normal food. And every dog feed that you buy is going to be different with the amount that you should give them, because based on how much protein or how much fat is in that formula, you're not going to give them the same amount of like Purina that you would give them of like Olroy or something like that. So if you switch bags of dog food, you need to know how much you should be feeding them based on the nutrients that are in that bag. Does that make sense? Now I'm just going to kind of hit on some other animals that can be considered companion animals. Obviously, dogs and cats are the big ones. But ferrets are actually another one that are kind of popular. There are more than 1 million ferrets that are kept as pets in the U.S. There are also they're domesticated European polecats, and they were domesticated as early as 2400 BC, so they've been around for a while. They are carnivores like cats. They can actually be used for rabbit hunting. However, they're not legal as pets in California. So that's another thing too, is like if you're going to get a pet that's like kind of a little out there, that's not a dog or a cat, or like a bird, you kind of need to be aware of like state laws, because a lot of states have restrictions on what kind of exotic animals you can have as pets. So just always something good to be aware of. Ferrets, like cats, are induced ovulators with a gestation length of 40 to 44 days, and they typically have about 8 to 10 kids. That's what their babies are called. So rodents actually can be kept as pets. There's been a growing interest in gerbils as pets. They're easy to take care of. Some of them can be very aggressive, especially if they're pregnant or, let's just say, lactating females. So gerbils, hamsters, guinea pigs, cavies, chinchillas, rats, and mice kind of all fall under that category. And so those can all be kept as pets. And there are about 2 million pet rodents in the U.S. So they're typically kept in cages or like aquaria type situation with sawdust, wood shavings, or like shredded newspaper bedding. So similar to other mammals, rodents can have one of two pigments in their fur. So the pigments that give their fur their color are either black or yellow. And then if you have a white or albino situation, that's just due to a lack of pigment. So you don't have either the black or yellow there, you just don't have any pigment. Some rodents can have patches of color, like if you've ever seen like gerbils or hamsters that have like black and yellow spots, you can have that happen. And color is genetically controlled, and there is a gene for each of the two pigments. So if you happen to, stray and you get a chinchilla or a rat and a mouse, there are commercially available feeds that are specifically formulated for these animals. And so they're typically in pellet form, so they're pretty easy to feed. And like I said, they're specifically formulated for each species. So if you have a chinchilla, you want to make sure you're getting chinchilla feed and not just like throwing it dog food or something like that. So the only thing with pet rodents is that there is a slight human health issue. So they may carry diseases. They carry like viruses and bacteria, and they can cause illness in people. That could lead to fever, vomiting, and abdominal cramps, as it does with any sort of bacterial or virus type deal. So the Center for Disease Control, or CDC, recommends that pregnant women and people with weakened immune systems should not bring a rodent into their home. So if someone already has like a weakened immune system because they have cancer and they're taking chemo or something like that, or if you have a pregnant woman, you don't really want to bring a new rodent in that's going to expose them to potential disease. And so you can always wash your hands after you're handling pet rodents. Laboratory animals is kind of another category. So rats and mice, hamsters are in third place, are widely used as research animals. And I would definitely say that's true. I've read a lot of studies where they use mice. And if you kind of think about what I said earlier, mice and humans and dogs have 94% of our genes in the same order. So you could kind of see where mice might be a good starting point to look at something that could genetically affect humans. And you can have a lot of mice, you can test a lot of mice, and they reproduce rather quickly, so you can get a lot of information. The rats have been bred in captivity for about 150 years. And then this is just some information about their reproduction. I'm not going to really ask you to know those numbers exactly, I don't think. So hamsters are another popular one. There are several species of hamsters that can be kept as pets. So there's the golden or Syrian hamster, Chinese hamster, dwarf hamsters. Hamsters are also rodents, and they're widely used as lab animals, but I would definitely say not as widely used as mice or rats. So there are about 0.8 million pet hamsters in the U.S. So guinea pigs are another one. They were domesticated in the Andes in South America, and there are about 0.6 million pet guinea pigs, so they're just a little fewer than hamsters. Their estrous cycle is about 15 to 17 days, and their gestation length is 68 days. So it's actually kind of long when you think of a rodent, something small like that. 68 days is kind of a long time. And then their litter size is typically 2 to 5. So they can be used as research models for human disease. Again, typically they use mice. And unlike most animals, guinea pigs actually require vitamin C in their diet. So most animals don't actually have to have it in their diet, but guinea pigs do. So that's another reason why if you have a guinea pig, you want to make sure you're giving it the right feed that's specific for that animal. So birds are actually another big category of companion animals. There are about 11.2 million pet birds in the U.S., and 4% of households have at least one bird. Sometimes if people have like smaller birds, they'll have a bunch of them. Parrots are typically pretty popular because they can actually learn words and they can kind of talk to you a little bit. Parakeets are the small or medium-sized parrots with long tails. So typically people will kind of have maybe more than one of those. And then budgies are the most common species of parrot that's kept as a pet. And so one thing with birds to remember is that a lot of birds have a very, very long lifespan, like very long. So I actually in my companion animals class, we talked about my teacher actually had an African gray, and she actually had to mention the bird in her will because based on when she got the bird and how long that type of bird lives, she is actually going to die before this bird does. So she had to include in her will who was going to get the bird. So just something to think about if you are getting a bird. Make sure that you know how long it's going to live because it could be a very big commitment and the bird may outlive you. So just something interesting, make sure you have family members that also like birds. So monkeys are another one that are pretty cool, but I wouldn't really recommend having them as pets. The idea is pretty neat, but there are about 15,000 monkeys kept as pets in the U.S. Monkeys are a tremendous responsibility. I don't actually even know how you go about getting a monkey because it's illegal to own monkeys as pets in a number of U.S. states. And so there are a lot of efforts to ban people owning monkeys in other states that currently don't ban them. And then some states require a permit. So monkeys are a big problem because they can carry zoonotic diseases. And so zoonotic diseases are diseases that can be transferred between animals and people. And so a lot of things about our genome between monkeys and people are very similar. So there are a lot of diseases that you could get from a monkey. So that's something to be aware of if you're in one of the states that allows monkeys and you want to have a monkey as a pet. And then lastly, there are reptiles and amphibians. So a lot of people have like lizards, snakes, turtles, frogs, and other reptiles that can be kept as pets. Turtles, there's about 2 million in the U.S. There are about 586,000 snakes, and that are kept as pets. There are a lot more in the wild, which I hate because I'm so terrified of snakes. Lizards, there are about 1.08 million. And then numerous ornamental fish are kept as companion animals. So fish are pretty popular. So does anybody have any questions on that lecture? I kind of went through it pretty fast. Any questions? Do you feel like you understood most of it? Anything? Okay. So if there are no questions, then I'm going to jump into the test review. And so typically what I try to do is go through the PowerPoints. But for the sake of time, because I want to make sure that I kind of cover all the review questions, I'm just going to kind of go through and talk you through them and ask some questions. So if you need to kind of write it down and I'm going too fast, feel free to tell me to stop. But just for the sake of time, I don't think we're going to have time to actually pull up every single PowerPoint. So I'm just going to kind of go through some review questions with you. Does that sound good? Okay. All right. So the test is going to be in a format of like multiple choice questions. There could be a matching section. Then there might be some short answer and then some true false. And then I think there's maybe a fill in the blank. So it's kind of a lot of different type questions. And hopefully that will kind of help because some people do better on certain types of questions. So hopefully I've kind of hit a question style that you like. Some of the questions may say like essay, but it's really like a short answer. There are no essay questions where I'm going to ask you to write a paragraph. Typically, any of the short answers are going to be like 1 or 2 sentences. It's just what I want. So nothing too extreme. So I'm kind of going to go through some questions and I'll ask you and then see kind of where y'all are at. And then if you don't know, then we'll kind of talk about it again. So of course, in the first lecture, we talked about what animal science is, and I gave you that definition. I'm going to expect you to give me a pretty good version of that definition. I would like you to know what animal science is, and I'm not going to count the science of animals because I've seen that a lot on tests, and that doesn't count. So make sure that you give me some sort of version. It doesn't have to be word for word what I had on that slide, but something about the science that underlines the breeding and husbandry of animals, something like that, not just the science of animals. So make sure that you understand what animal science is from that definition. So then we also talked about why animal science is super important because we need to become more efficient because by 2050, the world population is expected to grow. And does anybody remember what number I kept talking about? The population growth that's expected to happen, how many people we're expected to feed and have on the planet by 2050?
9 billion.
So it's close. It's like 10 billion is a little bit closer. So like 9.5, 10 billion is kind of the number that I want you to be familiar with. So yeah, good job. That was close. So make sure you know that because that is really what is driving everything in animal science is to feed the 10 billion by 2050. So make sure that you're familiar with that number. So then we kind of talked about the driving forces behind why agriculture needs to be more efficient. So if you think back to some of those earlier lectures, we talked about how population growth is a big factor that's driving that. Countries are becoming more developed, so that means you have more people that are getting more money, that are eating more meat. And then urbanization is also another factor that is driving the need for agriculture to be more efficient. And then we also have a decrease in farmland. So that's another reason is that we don't have as much available farmland anymore to be able to raise all these livestock on and crops. So we need to make sure that we're more efficient with the smaller amount of land that we have. So can anybody tell me what the difference is between greenfield development and brownfield development, thinking back to some of those earlier lectures?
Brownfield development is like areas where buildings and stuff used to be at, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. So brownfield is new development that's on land that was previously used for other things like factories or other buildings. And then greenfield development is when development is occurring on land that hasn't been used for other buildings. So like on agriculture land that wasn't previously developed. So the way I kind of keep that straight is that greenfield development, you think of like a new green field and it hasn't been developed before. And then if there was a factory or something on it, obviously it's not going to probably have a lot of grass. It's going to be ugly and brown. Don't know if that helps you, but that's how I keep it straight. So then we talked about the use of improved genetics for agriculture, that kind of came around when people started using genetics to improve like the amount of yield that they were getting from crops and things like that. And so that all kind of happened during a period known as the what revolution? Does anybody remember? I kind of made a little letter association with genetics. It starts with a G. Green. Yep. So the green revolution is the use of improved genetics for agriculture. So green genetics both start with a G. That's kind of how I keep that straight. And so because of the green revolution during the last century, there's been an increase in the yield for like wheat, rice, and then other cereals because of genetics, and you can actually select different genes that will give you an increase in yield. So make sure that you understand that. So does anybody remember what the major cereal grain is that we talked about that's used in a lot of livestock feed, the one that I kind of kept hitting on?
Corn.
Corn. Yep, good job. So corn is extremely important in animal science. It's an extremely important crop because it goes to a lot of, it's used in a lot of food for humans, and then it is also used in a lot of feed for pigs and poultry, and even some cattle. So make sure that you know that. So we also talked about the developing world. So like the US would be considered a developed country, but you have other countries that are developing. And so we kind of talked about animal agriculture in those types of situations. And so benefits that animal agriculture can have in the developing world. So like it can provide a way out of the poverty trap, and it can give you high quality nutrition because meat is a really good nutritional source. And then livestock can make a significant contribution to the poor, because they can actually start raising these animals for more money. And then livestock can also provide manure for fertilizing the soil. So, and lots of different benefits that livestock can have in the developing world. And so again, all of this is from your PowerPoints. So if you go through and just study the PowerPoints, nothing is coming from anywhere else. It's everything that I'm going to be asking is going to be from those slides. So just make sure that you're going through those. So we also talked about how there was a shift from the hunting and gathering stage to people planting and staying in one place. And that kind of occurred during a time that was called the Neolithic Revolution. So just kind of make sure that you're familiar with that term, that's when that whole shift happened, was during the Neolithic Revolution. And so during this time, there were permanent settlements. And so we talked about a lot of things that happened as a result of the permanent settlements. So can anybody remember like a couple of things that happened once permanent settlements got established? Like it led to the development of some things. Does anybody remember? So like, remember we talked about it led to the development of like the first military, because you had a need to protect your grains and things like that, because you have a need to protect your settlement because you're no longer on the road. So development of the first military. And then all of this kind of led to taxation and written language and record keeping, because all of a sudden you have this permanent settlement structure that you've got to keep up and running, and you've got to start keeping track of things. So because of all of this, you have the development of the first military, you have the taxation, written language, and record keeping that start. So society basically became more hierarchical. So you kind of had more levels of society and people within those different levels because of all of this coming about. Okay, so I know I've mentioned this several times. So can anybody tell me where many plants and animals were domesticated? What the area is called where most plants and animals were domesticated from?
The Fertile Crescent.
Fertile Crescent, yes, good job. So that would be a really good fill in the blank question for me to ask you. So make sure that you're familiar with the Fertile Crescent, and that is where plants and animals were domesticated from. Can anybody tell me what the first plant that was domesticated was? The like first type of plant? Corn is a type of this plant.
Grains.
Yeah, so cereals. Cereal. Yeah. So they're cereal grains, so you're right. Yeah, the first plants domesticated were cereals, which kind of sounds weird because you think of like Cheerios or something. But so make sure you know that. And so some of the cereal grains are like corn, wheat, and barley are kind of the main ones that you think about when you think about cereal grains. So make sure that you know kind of which ones fall into the category of cereal grains, and then anything that doesn't. Okay, so when cereals were domesticated, remember we talked about they were kind of chosen to be more efficient. Um, does anybody remember kind of like what they were chosen for? The seeds were chosen for? Would they be chosen for like their color or their smell or like how many seeds they produced? What do you think? If you're trying to be more efficient.
How many seeds they produced, right?
Right. So the amount of seeds that they're producing and then how easy is it to recover those seeds would be a really big factor in the domestication of cereals because color doesn't really matter at this point or smell or anything like that. You want to make sure you're getting the most bang for your buck. So you want the most seeds that are the easiest to harvest. So then we kind of talked about as the human diet kind of changed more to include more amounts of starch, that the human genome actually started to change to accommodate that. So if you can kind of think back, make sure that you know that as the diet kind of changed to include more starch, that the human genome actually did start to change with it to reflect that. And so we talked about an enzyme that I kind of mentioned that I'm pretty sure is in bold on the PowerPoint that is in saliva that actually initiates the digestion of starch and was something that came about as a result of the human genome changing. Can anybody tell me what that enzyme is? Starts with an A. Nope. So amylase is the enzyme that is in saliva that initiates the digestion of starch. And that's an important enzyme because without that enzyme, humans wouldn't be able to break down starch. So it's very important that that enzyme came about. So make sure that you know that enzyme. Can anybody tell me which animal was domesticated first?
Dogs?
Dogs. Yep, correct. So a lot of them were kind of around the same time period, but dogs were the first domesticated animal. So make sure that you know that. So then we also talked about the domestication of cats. And so cats were from the domestication of the Near Eastern wildcat. And what purpose did they kind of serve in the permanent settlements? How did they become domesticated? Why were they there?
Hunting the mice and stuff, trying to get the grains.
Right, exactly, to reduce the losses of stored grains. And so they basically, they basically did not really come about until permanent settlements. So they would not have been there wouldn't have been a need for them with the hunter-gatherer phase. So they didn't really come about until you had the need to store grain. And then, of course, like everything else, they were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent. So then we also talked about the domestication of sheep, goats, and cattle and why those were domesticated. So like they provide meat and milk, they can be a high quality protein source, and they could be raised by people in the permanent settlements. So make sure you're familiar with that slide. And then we also talked about horses and why they were domesticated, and I gave you a whole bunch of reasons on that slide. So like transportation, they were used as food back then and then to help with hunting. So know why horses came about and why they were domesticated. Like I've kind of mentioned before, I've given you several hints. Know what a feral animal is, be able to kind of give me a short answer of what it is. And so don't just say a wild animal. I want you to know that it was domesticated and has now gone back to a wild state. And then be able to give me at least one example. So can everybody think of an example of a feral animal? If you can't, it's in the slides. So make sure that you can give me an example and tell me what it is.
One of them was like a wild boar or something, right?
Yep. So you have wild pigs, there are feral cats, there's a whole section of that. But yeah, wild boars, wild pigs is a good example. So the United States has very high meat consumption compared to other countries. We talked about that. We talked about the top 3 animal production companies that are kind of the big 3 players. Does anybody remember what those are? And they're kind of really big countries in the world if you think about it to kind of get you started. There's kind of the top three that we talked about. So the U.S. is one. And then, can you tell me another one? China. Yep. China is another one. And then there's a big one in South America. What's the third one? Starts with a B?
Brazil.
Yep, exactly. Brazil. So the U.S., China, and Brazil are the top three players in animal production across the world. So that's really, really good to know. So there have been increases in animal agriculture for a lot of reasons. We talked about a lot of these reasons. So like nutritional reasons, more people are having more resources to buy food, and there's more of a preference for animal products. So what I would like you to be able to tell me is we already talked about the top three countries that are the animal production companies, and I want you to be able to tell me which country is the top for beef, which country is the top for milk. And remember, with milk, it gets a little tricky because does anybody remember what the top milk producing country is that we talked about? India, ringing any bells? Because remember, the U.S. is top milk for cattle, but India is top milk overall because they have milk from like water buffalo and other things that we don't have. So make sure you can tell me top country for beef, top country for milk overall, top swine country, and the top chicken country. So just so that you're familiar with that, because that is really good to know, and I kind of come across that stuff in my job still. So make sure that you can do that. Then I would also, from the career lecture, just kind of be able to give me like a few potential areas of employment for animal science graduates. So just give me like 3 examples, like biotechnology, the dairy industry, research, whatever. Just kind of be able to give me 3 examples of jobs or areas that animal science grads could work in. So another thing off of the PowerPoint was we talked about a transgenic animal. So make sure that you know what that is, that definition, and that you're familiar with that. So that it's just an animal whose genome has been altered to carry genes from other species. So, and I'm pretty sure that's going to be in bold on your PowerPoint. From the career lecture, we talked about like resumes and how you should really specify your resume to the kind of job that you want. Don't just have a generic one that you send to everybody. Then moving into the horse lecture, some things that we hit on that I kind of told you need to know. How are horses measured? What's the unit? Their height. How is it measured?
Hands.
Hands, right. And do you remember how many inches are in a hand?
4.
4, right, exactly. Good. See, y'all are doing well. Y'all on a roll. Does anybody remember the cutoff between a horse and a pony? What that hand measurement is?
14.2.
Yep, 14.2. Very good. So that's important to know so that you know what's a horse and what's a pony. And so where do you measure horse height? What point of the body?
The withers.
The withers, yeah. Well, you're on a roll. Does everybody remember that? The withers. So it's not from the head, it's from the withers. And so then there was a term that we used for any hoofed mammal, and we talked about how horses were kind of odd-toed, and then like cows would be even-toed. It's kind of a weird word. So ungulates is a term that I'm pretty sure was also in bold, so be familiar with what that means, and it's basically just any hoofed mammal. So when horses evolved, did they start off small and get bigger, or did they start off big and get smaller?
Small, get bigger.
Right. Good. So it was basically a gradual increase in their size. And then we talked about like evaluating conformation in horses. So kind of know like the different components of that. So you look at like their bone structure, musculature, and the proportions of their body. So kind of be familiar with those conformation slides. And so does anybody remember what the most important aspect of the equine conformation is? The first one that we talked about, and it's the most important. It's whether they're kind of overall, like whether they have overall balance. Does anybody remember that? Remember us talking about balance and how we talked about the slope of the shoulders and the slope of the hips and things like that? So balance is going to be your most important aspect when you're looking at equine conformation. And so speaking of that angle, we had that picture and I talked about a specific angle, and it's a number, so you may not remember. But if the horse has ideal balance, then the shoulders and hips should be at what angle? Is it like a really steep, like 90-degree angle, or
45 degrees?
45 degrees? Yep. So make sure that you're kind of familiar with that, because that's really good to know if you're ever evaluating livestock, is that it should be at a 45-degree angle. And so can anybody tell me what seasonally polyestrous means? We talked about it with a couple different species. So let's start with polyestrous. What does that term mean? Poly means many, right? And then estrus, cycles. So they have many cycles. And then what do you think seasonally means? Certain season of the year. So seasonally polyestrous means that they will have multiple estrus cycles, but only during part of the year. So if you kind of break down that term, then that's how you get that definition. Does that make sense to everybody? So we also talked about horses breeding and when they breed. And so what type of breeder are they considered? Are they considered like a short day breeder or a long day breeder? So they're going to be long day breeders because they're seasonally polyestrous. So it depends on the type of year that you're breeding them. And you want them to foal in the spring. And so you're going to breed them typically when days are getting longer. So they're long day breeders. And so then on the, really on all of them, especially with horses and then like dogs and cats, we went over the terminology. So like filly, colt, weanling, all of those terms that are on bold in those lectures, be familiar with those terms. Because that's something you should just know from animal science, so be familiar with all of that vocabulary. With any type of animal, if they are, okay, so let's see, I'm going to ask this. If they're, I guess I'll just say it. So stress, does that change their nutritional requirements or not? If an animal's stressed, yes, it does. And so make sure that you know that if an animal is really stressed, it's going to change their nutritional requirements. So we also talked about in horses and other species that the mother provides half of the chromosomes of the offspring, but then she also provides a certain type of DNA. And you can actually trace, this was important because you can actually look at this type of DNA for like racehorses. Does anybody remember? It's a part of the cell. Mitochondrial DNA. Yep, exactly. And so that's important in horses because that's kind of how you can track things. So make sure that you know that in horses and other species, the mother provides mitochondrial DNA. And so mother starts with an M, mitochondrial starts with an M. I make that little connection. So I would kind of like you to know, like just in general, how long animals' gestation lengths are. So like, just kind of know that like horses are almost a year. They're really long because typically the bigger the animal, the longer their gestation length is going to be. So horses are almost a year. And then cats and dogs are really similar. But actually, I think I said that backwards on your slide earlier. So cats are actually 60 days and dogs are more in the 50-ish range. So cats are just a little bit longer than dogs. So make sure you know that. And then rats and mice, we talked about, are really small. They're used in laboratory research because it only takes them like 20-ish days before they have a litter. So just kind of be familiar with those numbers so that you know like horses are really long, rats are really short, cats are like a little bit longer than dogs. Just to kind of have that generally in your mind. So with horses, we talked about how they're classified nutritionally. So they're monogastrics, they're herbivores because they eat plants, and they're hind winter. So be familiar with those. And then remember, non-ruminant and monogastric mean the same thing. So don't get those confused. They mean the exact same thing. So make sure you know how horses and how other animals are classified nutritionally. So when we talked about horses, we talked about the fermentation and the microbes. Does everybody remember we talked about the bacteria that's in their cecum and how it produces these really important fatty acids for the animal? Does anybody remember what they're called? So it's a 3-letter acronym, and so it's volatile fatty acids. So those are extremely important. Actually, in my intro class, we had to memorize that, and we had to know what the top 3 were. But so I'm not going to ask you to know the top 3. I'm just going to ask you to know that the microbes produce volatile fatty acids. So know what volatile fatty acids are and where they come from. So they come from the breakdown of cellulose by those bacteria. So then we also talked about body condition score, why that's important. We really hit on that in the horse lecture. So make sure you're familiar with that slide and kind of how you get a body condition score and what the ideal score for horses would be. We also talked about hybrid vigor and what that is. Does anybody remember what that is? So you have hybrid, so that means a cross, and then vigor is kind of like they're just really like vigorous. They're kind of a more like hardy animal. So remember we talked about hybrid vigor being an improvement in qualities that comes from crossbreeding genetically different plants or animals. So you get something that the offspring is better than either of the original parents. And does anybody remember what an example was that we used? Kind of in the equine family. That's a cross between a horse and a donkey. Mule. Yeah, so mule is a good example of hybrid vigor. So know what hybrid vigor is and be able to tell me an example. And then like I said, sorry, I'm kind of speeding up because I know it's time for y'all to go. So make sure that you know all the terminology from the lecture that I just went over. So like dam, sire, all the terminology for cats and dogs, be familiar with those because you could see any of those show up. Know what the essential amino acid is that cats need. Can anybody tell me what it is?
Taurine.
Taurine, right. Yep, that's definitely, you're going to see that because that's very important. And then what's cool about cats and how they ovulate? What are the terms that we talked about? Because they ovulate only after they've mated. So what's that called? Induced ovulators. Induced or reflex ovulators, either one. So it's induced, the act of mating induces them to ovulate. And then make sure you know that, like I said, that all of the members in the Canis genus can interbreed and produce fertile hybrids. So their offspring would be able to have offspring. And then remember we talked about dogs are actually omnivores. They're not carnivores because they can live off of things other than just meat. So cats are carnivores, dogs are omnivores. And then lastly, just another thing I want you to know is like, what's the danger of having a monkey as a pet that we talked about?
Zoonotic diseases.
Right. They can carry zoonotic diseases that can be transmitted from people to humans. So make sure that you know that. So that's kind of overall some review questions that I'd like you to look at and be thinking about. Those are the types of questions I'm going to ask you. Like I said, anything that's in bold or underlined or anything I'm trying to stress to you on a slide, good chance that's going to be on there. All the information on the test is straight from the slides. So if you study those, then you should be fine. Does anybody have any other questions? All good? Ready for the test?
Maybe.
Maybe. Just study the slides and you'll be fine. And then if you took good notes today, you should really be fine. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me or post in any of the discussion boards or anything on Blackboard. And I'll be checking that if you have any questions. And so with that, y'all have a good rest of your day and I will see you on Wednesday.
Okay, bye everybody.